Everybody, thanks for joining this talk. We're going to be discussing a very specific question that came out from a lot of discussions I've been having around the role of co-op education. And so this question is, should the goal of co-op education be primarily to incorporate cooperative businesses, or can they have a broader application in the social impact, social purpose sector? Before we get into it, let's do some introductions with our esteemed panel. So first off, I'm Christine Clark. I'm the co-founder of Freedom Dreams Cooperative Education, and we are an educational hub and co-op development service that creates resources and shares knowledge about BIPOC contributions to the cooperative movement and supports the development of BIPOC cooperative initiatives. And to my left?
Yes, I'm Gary. Hello, okay. Gary Hampton, I'm from Charleston, West Virginia. I'm an ACE board member, and also I'm part of the Ajani Group. The Ajani Group is a BIPOC-led worker cooperative that focus on education and business development for BIPOC businesses and cooperatives across the United States, and hopefully we'll be expanding after this conference into some other spaces and places. And so that's pretty much it right now. I'm just looking forward to the rest of the panel. And next to my left, I'm going to pass it on to Nadi.
Director for House Ontario, or House Canada now, and House stands for Housing Our University Students Equitably. What we do is we help develop student housing cooperatives using a pretty unique model that we borrow from UTEAL. And I am also a program director for the York nonprofit Housing Society Co-op. And so what we do at the York Co-op is that we organized legal leased housing co-ops in locales where multi-tenant housing, which shares a similar form and structure, is actually illegal, whether it be by municipal bylaws or things like that. And I also do a bunch of other stuff, but it's mostly student-related. So I'll pass it off to Charity.
Hello, I'm Charity Schmidt. I am a co-op developer and educator at the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives, and I direct an initiative that's funded by the city of Madison, Wisconsin to support and start worker cooperatives.
For joining me on this discussion. So where did this question come from? For me, it came from, as Freedom Dreams is growing and building our network in the co-op sector, we've been approached by a lot of organizations asking specifically, how do we do better outreach to BIPOC communities? And one thing we're realizing is you kind of have to dispense with the idea that you're teaching BIPOC communities something new, that cooperation, cooperative activities, and cooperative businesses are very rich within our communities. And so then the question becomes, okay, so then what is the role of cooperative education resources? And we've been playing with this idea of, well, there is already rich cooperation happening in communities that could actually be, the work that they're doing could actually be pushed forward, I hesitate to say leveled up. I don't think it needs to be leveled up, but we could build capacity by offering the resources that the co-op sector has, particularly around specific elements like how do you do democratic decision-making or member economic engagement, to assist the cooperation that's already happening. So I just wanted to underline that, right? To assist the cooperation that's already happening. And so this becomes an issue not of the co-op sector saying, well, how can we just take what we already have, this business model, and impose it on BIPOC communities? But it's more of a question of, well, is there something that we have in our toolkit that can support what BIPOC communities are already doing. So this is the context for this question, and I'm hoping, I'm saying I'm hoping it will lead to a fruitful discussion, but we've already had these discussions, and I want to bring some of that energy and that liveliness that we have when we're talking about this issue to more of this open platform. So I'm gonna really just start it there, that question of, well, one, when we're talking about building capacity for cooperation among BIPOC communities, should the goal of co-op education be what we currently see with a lot of resources out there, which is incubating businesses? Should we keep going down that route? And if so, what are the benefits? Or should we start thinking about creating co-op educational resources that has that broader application to the social impact sector? So I'm not gonna say I'm gonna start with Gary, I'm gonna start with Natty, I'm gonna start with Charity. Let's just, let's just get in there and have this conversation.
I'll go ahead and go first with answering this, or just putting some little perspective into it. Is, beyond the business model, is that's to me that can be the most minute piece, but it's one of the largest pieces that's focused on. But within the business model and the social impact space, there's room for social change, and with that being said, is the co-op business model has the capacity to go beyond the bottom line to impact communities based on what is their social purpose, what is their social calling. Because in most cases, the co-op business is actually going to be addressing and filling a community gap or need. So in itself, it already has that social component within it. But then does it fall within the culture of the co-op itself? Does it fit within the culture of the community that it's addressing? And so now in my perspective, I feel that you could take the social impact conversation and actually make it part of the DNA of not only the business, but also the community in which it works. And then I think you'll see a holistic approach to community wealth building as well, because you have resources within the network, but we could be very much more effective with it. And it's the cooperation isn't just within business, it's across the community. And the healthier the community is, the healthier and more viable the business will be, and the outcomes of the business in the community, whether creating jobs or even sustaining itself or its existence, could come down to that holistic look at community wealth building. And that's beyond business. If we stay focusing on business, then we'll really miss out on the true opportunities of changing our communities, locally and across the world.
And like Gary, you said, do the resources, those educational resources, fit the culture of the communities that are using them? And I just wanted to, Charity, I don't know if you wanted to speak to that in your own work with co-op, offering co-op development and co-op education, speaking to that piece. Does the resources fit the culture of the communities?
I think that's a challenge. And so one of the ways that we handle that in Madison, because the Madison Cooperative Development Coalition is a staff of one. It's me, and I'm this white girl in the community. So one of the things that we do is we partner with community-based organizations who are embedded in the community, in the neighborhoods, who know what the needs are, who know what the capacity is, who can provide training, education, support, and culturally relevant, linguistically relevant ways. And so I think that's like a cornerstone, or really like the most important part of the programming that we do, is we re-grant to these community-based organizations that we partner with. For example, Worker Justice Wisconsin is a workers' rights center who, serves and who works with and helps organize the most vulnerable and exploited workers in our community, right? So they're having conversations about co-ops, about getting rid of the bosses. With them, it's like, how can you get out of this situation of being exploited? And again, the vast majority of the folks that the Workers Center serves are either undocumented or Spanish speaking, and so it's really important that delivery is culturally and linguistically relevant to them, and that's why those partners are so important. To spread the work out.
Sorry, I really appreciate how generally like that social impact needs to kind of actually foreground any kind of action around the business model. So like at House, we understand that affordable housing is a huge issue, and then just understanding how that impacts students and why it's really important to really address affordable housing is because disproportionately the students who are needing housing, for example, at York University, it's titled, or it's seen as a commuter campus. It's only a commuter campus if you live in Canada, if you're a domestic student, if you live around York University, which means that if you're an international student, you're really relying on that housing market. Generally, international students are members of BIPOC communities. And even for the folks who live near York University, they're disproportionately racial students. In the community immediately surrounding it, 1 in 5 people are specifically racialized, but Black members of the community. And so, like, how do you make sure that housing is affordable for them? How do you make sure that they're included in the decision making? It's not really to be like, okay, hey, we have this cooperative model, we're trying to develop a housing cooperative, but rather it's saying, hey, would you like to be a real stakeholder in the decision-making process? Do you want to engage with your university? Would you be interested in organizing an affordable housing committee where you're the ones who are essentially galvanizing support amongst your constituents, your members, you're the ones working with your student union to see what maybe the priority is and to understand what the current context is within where you live, because you know better than we do, and then how can we help develop that? How can we help you develop resources? And so this doesn't just exist at York University, for example. We're trying to work with the folks at UConn University, where they were very, very clear, like, only one out of, let's just say, they have 108 units for 6,000 students. It's not enough housing for student housing, and disproportionately, the folks, again, who are going there are international students who go to the private rental housing market. That is increasingly being unaffordable. Just last year, the wait list for social or affordable housing increased by 320%, right? And it's folks in that community who really need that housing most. So how do you kind of balance the needs of folks who are coming in to study, that really need an affordable place to live, and the members of the community who are also really looking for an affordable place to live? And so that's why we try to engage, folks from the UConn University Student Union. We say, like, hey, this is a conversation we need to have with you. And through those kinds of engagements, you can see like what kind of social impacts might come out of it. So we start working with groups like UConn University First Nations initiatives. We try to connect to the First Nations groups that are immediately surrounding the university, like Quan Lin Dun, sorry. And to see if potentially there's a way to bridge the gap between the students who are there and the First Nations group who are there, so that we could actually develop. And then how do we bring the money that we're able to kind of capture in the public sector and, for example, bring it to First Nations community leaders to do facilitation around the planning, facilitation around the design, and really, really kind of framing that, again, in alignment with the students' union, with the folks, the actual students themselves who are eventually, hopefully, going to be living in this housing. And then what kind of activities do we kind of see operating out of that, right? Like, is it co-design charrettes? Is it journey mapping workshops? And then how do we keep that like permanent, not just within the activities that we're doing, but within the development itself? How do we kind of maintain that culture? And so that social impact, it comes like way, way before any of the business planning that we're doing. Like, we understand that we could build 80 units there and get X amount of money, and we'd pay off the development in 25 years or whatever it might be. But the key thing is, like, how do we integrate these elements long before we begin the development so that we're actually like very, very much actually planning for social impact rather than planning for a viable business model.
I just want to uplift everything you just said, Nancy, because sometimes I wonder, is that limiting, when we talk about co-op education, are we limiting our reach when we start the conversation with, this is the business model, as opposed to starting the conversation with that social impact piece? What is the issue that the community is facing, right? Starting there, and then speaking in terms of, okay, we might be able to approach that issue through democratic decision making, even those fundamental questions like, would you like to co-design this process, right? All of these things are cooperative activities, but you're speaking about them in a language, that's not so tied to the model. It makes me think of, I'm also on the board of directors of Local Food and Farm Co-op, which is an Ontario-based co-op that supports the development of food and farm businesses. And our project manager, who does co-op development in Northern Ontario communities, she said, when I start with the model, I get resistance because some community members are saying, oh, this is just another colonial model that you're trying to impose on us, right? So there's instantly, we don't want to be a part of that. But when she starts with, what are the issues that the community wants to address, and engaging in that process, and then speaking more in the language of, cooperative activities, do you want to be, involved in the decision making? Do you want to be involved in the finances? Then it's like this aha moment. Actually, yeah, we do want to do all of that. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe the model, in that community planning, maybe 5 months down the line, then it's like, okay, well, maybe the model might work for what you're doing. And so that piece of, and I'm interested to hear from Charity and Gary as well, your own experiences with that. Have you come across, when you just lead with the model, this is the model, have you experienced any type of resistance to that? And if so, what are some of the alternate ways you've been able to engage with the groups?
I think one of the challenges is individuals not really being aware of what the co-op business model is. So you're almost coming in just like me coming into Canada. I don't speak French. You know what I mean? So it's almost like you're speaking a foreign language to individuals right there within your community sometimes, because they do not understand, they don't know what the model is. So there's a gap there already when you start the conversation, unless you're already in a community that's familiar with the model. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is individuals understanding what the model is, and then also is not labeling and limiting the model to almost like a socialist or socialism lens, because it's far more than that. It has its capitalistic components, because you have to generate revenue to sustain the income or to sustain the effort, and so it really comes down to, I think one of the first pieces is creating awareness of what the cooperative business model is, what the cooperative ecosystem is, and then don't lead with the business model. Again, I think leading with what can the business model address, and then is what results are desired, from that investment of time, energy, money, and resources, and then at that point, I feel like you could really get the optimal outcomes from your investment through the cooperative ecosystem. So that's.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. It's an interesting question. I feel like a lot of the education I do is I am leading with the model, but I think where the more fruitful work comes in is when you're planting seeds in different places about co-ops. So for example, sorry, I like examples. We work with a social good accelerator, and those are people who are coming to this accelerator program, and they're like, I want to do this thing. I want to create, this way of serving this particular need in my community. and they're learning, well, like, how could that look, exploring what should I do? How should I do it? And incorporating co-op education into those kind of like accelerator programs or other kinds of programs are like, a co-op might be the way to do it. Here's what it would look like if you did it as a co-op, and maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't. But, so front and center in that kind of situation is, what is the need? What do you want to accomplish? And then is the co-op like the right model for doing that? And I think that's where you're planting those long-term seeds, and getting people to think about it. But it's really the mission that's driving that work, and not the model itself.
Just to add to that a little bit, it like with students, there's obviously a learning or integral element, and when those pieces are kind of excluded from traditional post-secondary education, there's a lot of adjusting. But like, I don't want to revolve the conversation just around students. We also work with a group called Guyana Community House, and really what they're trying to do is, like, for example, build the capacity of the Guyanese Canadian community to have, for example, their own community center, to have public services that are available to, that are culturally appropriate and available to Guyanese Canadian community members. And the big thing that they seem to bring up is that there's not a lot of trust in what's already out there. There's not a lot of trust in the public services where they face discrimination, not a lot of trust in housing services, because again, same kind of issues. And so, and they don't have a lot of trust in the political representatives that are there. And so we see, like, all of these issues, and we're not like suggesting, okay, well, let's help you overcome those issues. But then we propose the model of saying, okay, well, if you don't necessarily trust these different areas or these different sectors, well, how can you work together? How can you find, different members of the Guyanese Canadian community that are successful entrepreneurs or folks that are involved in legal action or political activism? And then how can y'all work together to essentially, maybe create your own Guyanese Canadian, like a cultural community center, or, integrate or build housing through that. And then we try to leverage our position, house with our existing networks, with like nonprofit developers to be like, okay, well, let's, now that you kind of have this vision, what would that look like if we were to actually practically build this out? How would it be governed? And that's really where we introduce the cooperative model. We just say, okay, well, you can have different seats at the table. You can actually kind of buy into this piece. And so, like, the education comes as, like, we're looking at different objections that folks are facing that they're already, seeing as challenges within the community, and we're being like, well, this part of this model might actually work here, and trying to build that up so that they have the capacity to understand, okay, like, maybe how could this model work to actually overcome our objections? So yeah.
And putting that model out there, and what the two of you were saying is, I think a big part of that is when I was speaking to awareness, is also the stories. The stories can lead the way as examples for buy-in, acceptance, and potentially moving communities and individuals into converting to the cooperative business model or participating in the model. And so is being able to illustrate, like, examples, whether it's within that community or from outside that community, just showing that, hey, this works, this is how it works. And then as you were speaking, is that can help kind of get the buy-in, like, oh, this is how it works. Okay, I can tell you how it works, but here's that story to back it up to actually sell it. So, and I think that's sometimes part of the shortcoming is I don't think we do a good job of really telling the stories. And then with that stories, we're going to let people know that you're make them aware, and it's available, it's here, and then is, how do you connect it? How does it become accessible? And I think as, and that educational piece has to be embedded not only within the front end, but also throughout the cooperative itself once you get it going, because education is going to be that foundational piece and that strengthening piece that'll hold everything together and potentially propel it to be able to be sustained or prolong its existence, and then is really seeing the impact. So
piece is key, and it's also that question of what kind of stories are being told. And I think that this is where co-op education is falling short, and particularly in telling the stories of cooperation among BIPOC communities. And where the adherence on the incorporated business model is an obstacle is that ignores all of those rich stories of cooperation in our communities, right? So this question of should the educational resources be for the purpose of incorporated businesses, or can it have a broader application for the social impact space? That's also a question of broadening the idea of cooperation in the mainstream so that it's telling our stories. I like examples to charity. So, for example, when I started in the co-op sector, I was really just energized by the story of Fannie Lou Hamer, right? And the Freedom Farm Co-op, which was an agricultural co-op. But let me tell you, my mind was really expanded reading the work of Dr. Carolyn Shanaz Hossein, a professor at U of T Scarborough, who does really rich work on researching Roscas, and we had Juliette and Obi and Jean-Marie speak about the role of Roscas in their co-ops. That history, right? Because Roscas aren't incorporated, co-ops in Canada, but it is a rich ancestral mode of cooperation. Also, even hearing Dr. Hossein talk about the Underground Railroad, that was cooperative activity, but it doesn't get labeled as such because it doesn't follow an incorporated model. Yet when we hear those stories, that's the stories that are electrifying my generation to go, wow, this is what cooperatives can do, And so I absolutely agree with that piece. And I know we talked about it, that how do we do outreach to community? You said storytelling. And yeah, the resources have to expand to say these stories are just as much, and I was gonna say just as much cooperative endeavors as, the modern co-op Rochdale pioneers. They're just as much, and also they're older. You know what I mean?
All the stories matter.
Yeah.
And that comes down to it is tell the stories, and the stories do matter. All stories matter, and is when we narrow that lens, we narrow the outcomes and the impact. So we definitely have to tell more stories and connect those stories to the broader community. And it's not a matter of, okay, this story is about this demographic. Let me keep it here. You know what I mean? No, is the stories need to be told alongside the history that's being told and in parallel. And then it's deepening the story's presence in front of those audiences that you're trying to target and connect with, so that they can connect with it, but is see that it works. It can work here, but then also is, again, cooperation is not just a business model. It takes the community to sustain a healthy business. So what are the environmental justice factors, and what are the capital factors? Who are the players? What are the relationships as well? And so is that the stories can tell those things, and also bring some light to the challenges on the social impact issues within those relevant communities.
And I think there's also, just on the thread of stories, there's also an element where those stories are actually binding the community to the co-op, right? Like that's arguably maybe really where that stake or that ownership actually comes in. And with reference again to the Guyana Community House, what was initially proposed is like a solution for, okay, like how would we potentially fund a Guyanese Canadian cultural community center? Well, the first idea was to set up a community bond issue, and it was a very, very top-down idea. It came from some members in the community who were quite familiar with that kind of thing. But if you have issues with trust, right? If you have like pre-existing issues with trust within the community, why would a member from that community trust to just pay money to this incorporation that is probably just going to invest it and say, yes, we will give you a 3% return. It's an unfamiliar model, and it's in the same institutions and the same structures that they were historically excluded from. How do you ensure that they're actually going to get that money? So you're already setting something up that might potentially fail, and it's just not taking the time to recognize that in Guyana, and we're just on the note of Roscas, that there already is a model that works like that. It doesn't need to be so formalized, and that actually fosters more relationships between community members. It's not piloted or taken care of by a broader, bigger institution that might potentially alienate some members of the community. And whether there are some like ethno-cultural divisions, no, it allows for very, very culture-specific, community and people-specific solutions that can be brought together, that can be pooled together, that are really operating outside of like this traditional financial institution space through this community bonds issue. And so like bringing that story to the fore, right? Like bringing this, essentially this Rosca model that has already been operating in Guyana for some time, and being like, this is how it works, and y'all have piloted this a long time ago, right? And showing how it's worked. It gives ownership. It gives the sense of, okay, like we've done this, we can do this again. Why not try to bring this to Toronto, and why not try to bring this to communities like North York with a really high Guyanese Canadian population? So yeah.
I think it's important to like point out and name why we're not telling the stories, or why the stories are more unhidden. And it's because when we're dependent on outside funding, it's like funders, whether it's foundations or whether it's like municipalities, cities, they want the metrics, right? They want how many co-ops did you start? How many jobs have you started? All of those numbers. And so the stories, they go untold, they go unheard. And I think that's sad, and that's just like why I loved your question that you set up for us today, Christine. Is it about starting co-ops, or is it about something bigger? And I think that's really important. I don't know if anybody else listens to Black Star, Talib Kweli, and Mostef now, Yassine Bey, but there's a line in their new album that says, you'll always be the winner if you decide what the metric is. And we are so subjected to other people's metrics, right? And like, how do we create our own? And you talked so beautifully the other day about the non-economic, impacts of the Roscas and stuff. And I love that so much, because that stuff all matters, and that's like why we're here and why we're doing the work. But that's not what we have to write in a funding proposal, right?
Up Black Star, and that will be our outro music for this for this session. Get on it. But going back to Charity, you mentioned that as part of your work, collaborating with other community organizations who are in community, understand the needs of community, have the lived experience, partnering with them to develop those resources, right? Especially for organizations where leadership is not from a non-racialized background is so key. And I mean, personally, that's where I would like to see the sector headed, is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The co-op sector itself broadening its scope, right? Instead of always looking for the answers within itself, building those community partnerships so that the co-op education resources are relevant, to the communities that it's serving, that those resources recognize the cooperation that's already happening. And, the other reason why this question came to me, it is about that coalition, or not to me, to us, because honestly, as I've asked this question to many different cooperators, they've already had kind of the same idea brewing, that the co-op sector does have resources to add, but for a larger purpose. And I just want to, and I'm going to ask this question, but I'm asking it from a Canadian context. And maybe Charity and Gary, being our American neighbors, you have a different perspective. But, I feel that in Canada, in the Canadian, in the co-op development sector, there's a bit of this divorcing itself from the larger social and solidarity economy. And where I'd like to see co-op development and education is connect itself back in there. Because particularly when we talk about, well, as the co-op sector asks itself, how do we reach BIPOC communities? BIPOC communities are already doing a plethora of activities that they're not co-ops, but they are under this banner, social and solidarity economy, whether it's ROSCAs, whether it's community gardens, whether it's collectives that are working on a non-hierarchical structure, all the mutual aid associations that we saw that were Black and queer-led, a strong Black and queer-led movement of mutual aid. All of this is there. And I feel that the co-op sector sort of has to ask itself, not how do we build more co-ops to build a better world, but how do we take what we have to offer to continue that work that's already being done, And Gary, I see your mic's up ready to. Yeah, but it's kind of like, that's the question, right? As co-ops, we are part of this larger coalition, so that when it comes time to make those resources, it's like, okay, let's reach out to folks doing mutual aid. Let's reach out to folks doing equity and diversity, equity inclusion professionals with lived experience doing this social and solidarity work, because we are all working toward the same cause. So it's almost a comment and almost like a jumping off point, Gary, you had the mic up.
Oh, well, I mean, immediately the first thing I got to thinking about was, all of those pieces, those either anchor institutions, other organizations doing the work, are part of the community wealth building ecosystem, and are essential to having that healthy, vibrant community. And yes, it's beyond money, but is the big thing is, I think, is looking at cooperation is, let's set this level of trust, and it's is not just within the business model, but within the community. And then is, once you have that trust, and now you have a relationship. Now you can look at what do we want from this relationship? How can we collaborate? And I think sometimes that's missed, and things kind of end up in silos to where there's these disconnects, and I think is, we look at how things are, I'm going to say, intertwinkled. They're intermingled and intertwined, and it's intersectoral. Yeah. So is all of those things factor into that the health and wealth of that community, and is what do we see as wealth? We have to look at those relationships. We have to look at the mindfulness of the community and its people, and then is, how effective are we going to be at those resources and tools and stuff that are there, and then is we can have strong collaborations with that trust. So I feel like I'll pass.
Yeah, I guess if I could develop that into a question. I don't know. It was just my, we're having this conversation, but just that piece of, I'm gonna frame it like this. I was at like many people in the room, the CMC Congress in Calgary, and sort of the question was, are co-ops still relevant? Was sort of the kind of foundational question, And if they're not, how can co-ops be relevant to what's happening right now, particularly as, we're seeing the ongoing impacts of COVID, both on the economy and communities who are negatively impacted. And so this idea of the alternative economy is once again, in the mainstream. And so the question is, where does co-op education resources fit into that? Would be a more succinct way. If it's not the business model, if it's not, and of course, I don't want to say it shouldn't be about incorporating co-ops. Because even as the developer, you understand that when you take a group through a process, the end goal might be that a co-op just isn't the right model, right? So But if that's the case, does co-op educational resources still have a role to play? You know, and if so, what is it?
So I'll say something. Yeah, I think co-ops are great. They can be such an important buffer for like individual workers, right? And to improve their lives, improve the life for their families, improve their job situation, to have that say and dignity in the workplace. And I think that's really important. But that buffers the harm of capitalism rather than building a movement to actually counter the harms of racial capitalism, of individualism, et cetera. So I think co-op education has a role to play in, the particular individual businesses, and those can have a lot of spillover effects in the community. But if we're really interested in buffering those harms of capitalism, in a broader way, like in your question, the education has to not just be about starting those, one business here, one business here. It really has to be like, how do we build that solidarity economy? How do we work with other people in that solidarity economy and mutual aid societies with land trusts, et cetera? Because I think that's like, it's like kind of why we're all in the room together, is like we see a better way. And how do we start to build that? And that education has to be broader if we want to build the culture to counter all the harms, right?
Education also has to be accessible. If we want the diversity at the tables, we want the equity, we want the inclusion, is that education cannot solely reside behind paywalls, because then you're limiting the accessibility. So we have to make that education available on a broader level to broader cross-section of individuals by limiting and removing the paywalls, and then now we're really talking about equity. Now we're going to see the inclusion, because people are going to be able to participate more, and so then now we'll see rooms more full with the diversity in the faces due to that. So
for me, co-op education has been like really important in kind of framing how, organizations that are already doing a lot of social impact work, particularly and I'm thinking, those that are doing them at a community-based level, those that are not incorporated, in my space, definitely student clubs. And I'm thinking of groups like, Many Green Hands, where they organize volunteers to, help build different community-based spaces that are outdoors, whether it be gardens, whether it be greenhouses, or groups like, Carbon Free York. It helps structure how those different groups could actually work together towards a bigger and broader goal, and towards making a bigger and broader social impact. And to me, that the co-op education piece comes in, and it's not saying okay, well, you should incorporate, Many Green Hands so that, you might be able to get access to this funding, and then same thing, Carbon Free York, so that you can get access to this funding. But it's okay, well, what if we brought you two together, and we connect? And I'm dropping names of organizations so they get as much exposure out there. That way people know them. But what if we bring you together under a group that already does this work, across multiple chapters and multiple spaces, maybe a group like Regenesis that really does this on university campuses, and then we take the ethos that y'all are trying to do and this very, very community-based, very, very community-facing practice, and rather than, limiting it to students, help bridge that within this broader group. Right, so cooperative education is saying, okay, how can these organizations cooperate together to have the biggest impact? How can they work together to create grant proposals where they're actually able to submit something and get even more money? And everybody that's a part of it, right? Everybody that's doing this work is able to kind of share, I guess, from that pot to create a bigger and better impact, and do it on a broader scale across more areas, and help organize more folks in the same way that they're already doing it, kind of unconventionally organizing students, organizing volunteers, and expanding the reach of the work that they're kind of doing. So yeah, sorry, this is my piece. Yeah.
that is just jumping off both Charity and Natty, that So again, as I ask that question, and what is the relevance of co-op education, whether you're working with a group and you get to the point where, well, maybe co-op model isn't for you. But Charity, you also said, the goal here is an alternative to the harms of capitalism, to the extraction and exploitation of capitalism, right? And Nati, you spoke about these cooperative strategies to help organizations, regardless of the business model, to build, right? In these non-hierarchical ways, in these ways that, right, that take into consideration co-op principle, concern for community, which is number 7, right? This is resources that any one of these organizations should be able to have access to when they're asking themselves that question. How do we build our organization so that we're not replicating the harms of capitalism, so that we're not replicating these oppressive power dynamics that we see in this these capitalist traditional business structures? Like, to me, that's how co-op education. I'm not going to say sector. Who was it? Was it you, Charity, or Esther? You said I don't call it the co-op sector. Esther West, Latinx co-op power. I'm also going to do a shout out that said, you don't refer to it as the co-op sector, you refer to it as the co-op movement. Right, yes. But this idea of, that the resources can be applied, right, more broadly to anyone asking that question. How do we build an organization that has this non-hierarchy so we're not replicating those oppressive power dynamics? I feel like that's the question of the times right now, right? As so many people are just tired of the work, of these work environments that we've seen under capitalism. And there's a huge opportunity for co-op education to step into that role, to say, you know what, these are the 7 principles, and within each of those principles, here are the strategies and approaches to build these types of organizations that center care and collectivity. So yeah, there's a huge opportunity, and I guess the question is, how do we create how do we create that, which I guess we can move into that part. I know we talked a little bit about, can I get non-traditional here? Can we throw out to the audience for questions on anything that we discussed? We actually only have 4 minutes. 4 mics. But we're just talking about this question of expanding co-op education in order to tackle that central question of how do you build organizations, regardless of business model, that espouse alternative economies and communities of care. And I'm interested from folks out in the room, your thoughts on that. And so this is Esther West, co-author Latinx Co-op Power.
Hey. Nice. This is so good. I love your thoughts, all of your thoughts. Thank you. I have to write down my things or else I can't ask. I appreciate this. And some thoughts that come to mind are like, are we using our co-op power to the fullest? And is that part of our education? So like when I was at Equal Exchange, I was in their interfaith program, and we had a network of 12,000 actively buying congregations who purchased our fair trade products for a coffee hour, etc., because there was that mission alignment. And so the customer base and supply chain is part of that co-op power to me. And is that part of the education? And then, like with P6, like the co-ops, the co-ops working together, there's that critical ecosystem element of peer-to-peer learning versus what talks about the business, one-off business kind of development that goes on, which is more like co-op developers like taking ownership and then like saying they're creating a co-op, it's like, no, we're working in solidarity together, like, and so, but there's this attitude almost of like, okay, I will create this co-op, this co-op, this co-op. They may or may not be connected to each other, versus encouraging people to connect as much as they can and then build that P6. If y'all have thoughts, that'd be great too. Thank you.
And speaking to that is, and speaking to what Nadi was speaking on as well, is, you can have that formal and informal organizing, but is the key piece is, and this is my little acronym for the power of the word co-op, is collectively organizing toward ownership of power, place, and prosperity through common purpose. So is when you can bring individuals together to serve a common purpose with that impact or result being visible on the other end, then is you can use those education and economic tools far more effectively, because is you have a common mission, and then you have resources. For instance, there's resources here, there's resources here, there's resources here, there's resources there, there's resources in this room. So is how can we take our conversations and the work that we do and collectively connect it and organize it to move the movement, and so is it doesn't have to be formal, it can be informal, but is how effective are we at it? And I think a lot of times is once you get past those first 7 principles, is, I say is, we pray and hope and fight for equity, but its efficacy, our sense through self-determination, is something that we can really take control of and have power over to move things forward. So how effective are we going to be with those tools, those resources, and those relationships to change the environmental aspects of our community on a mindful level, on a physical level, across the board? And it takes working together and seeing a vision that we all can believe in and trust in.
The emphasis on the informal, I was thinking about the exact same thing. And Esther, when you were mentioning, peer-to-peer learning within that process, again, like I'm just thinking about like the most impactful moments, whether it be a house or whether when we're working with different, whether it's like the workers' co-ops like Cycle York or we're working with the housing co-op, is that those peer-to-peer learning moments, like those more informal, not kind of group-based education sessions, like those are probably the most valuable. When I'm working with like different grants writers and they're like, oh, like why would I need to maybe like incorporate this, or why did you make those edits? Or when I'm talking about like when I'm changing some things in the structure of the work that they're trying to put forward, I do refer back to the Rockdale principles. I do refer back to, okay, like why would we, for example, want to include Cycle York within a housing development plan? We're really trying to build the whole sector, right? Like the whole every other cooperative that's out there. We want to make sure that folks have access to affordable and non-private transportation, and we also want to make sure that the folks who are doing that work are well paid. But it just comes with like incorporating that within those kind of informal learning moments. And that's something that they carry on in like each of the grants that they do, right? In the continuous work that they're trying to do. And it's something that benefits, not just our group or the groups or the stakeholders that we're trying to build housing developments for, but also the other folks that are already kind of doing this groundwork in different localities, right? And so I think that informal, like trying to preserve that informal is probably the most important part. Like not trying to formalize this part in education process, constantly having moments for this learning to happen. It's just the most impactful. I find that people tend to take that away. And if I've seen like one application and I look at another and I see that thing carry over, like that to me is great, because I'm not repeating that learning. I'm not repeating kind of the sharing of information that's happening there. Folks have really kind of integrated it, and it's been ingrained in what they're doing in their day-to-day. And like that to me is meaningful. That to me actually like builds confidence in the kind of movement, and just being like, okay, this works exceedingly well. but yeah, no, I really appreciate trying to maintain the informal. And I think those relationships are just so real. They're not like calculated. They're not like, okay, we need to do this in order to get money, but it's like, we need to do this to help other people. And again, it returns to that question of social impact, returns to that question of like what builds stronger, better, community wealth or communities of wealth. And yeah, so I really did appreciate that contribution. And thank you.
Thank you to both. So we're going to go to an online question before we come back to the room for questions. So we have Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard has a question.
Oh, I turned on my camera and then forgot my mic. So now I think I can talk. Can you hear me? Great. Yeah, I just wanted to actually reiterate what people were saying. I'm not sure I have a question, though. I guess you could respond to my comments. But yeah, I wanted to reiterate how important this, right? We always seem to be apologizing for informality, right? But really, to me, that's what popular education is about, right? That's what that Freire model is, right? It's that we're all learners, we're all teachers, we all, we need to come to a space with mutual respect. And sometimes I see co-op developers and co-op educators not coming from that framework, right? And so it can be still very hierarchical, right? Not recognizing that people already have some experiences that they could bring to this, right? But that may not use the same terminology we use and that kind of thing. So I often have been talking about, and I guess I'm wondering how you all see it and if it's helped you too, but to remind people of the things that we already do as cooperators, as members of solidarity economies. We participate in barter, we do solidarity things, we have, our mutual aid societies. And so I'd like for us to start with what people are already doing and then build on that, and start with the legacies and build on that. And I was just wondering if you all find that helpful or not. And of course, the aim is self-determination, right? Economic justice, self-determination. And so how do we get there? We've got to teach with that aim in mind, right? We can't teach and then say, okay, and now after all this hierarchical teaching, you're going to be self-determined.
Thank you for your comment, Dr. Nemhard. I'm going to put it over to our panelists.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely speak on it. Sorry. No, the goal at the end is absolutely self-determination. I guess like more broadly as a sector and as a whole, and that informality I think really does preserve that. But it also fosters, a kind of self-reliance. And when I'm saying that, I'm just thinking about like a juxtaposition with a more formalized process. If there is a more institutionalized form of cooperative education, or there is like a mandate that is shared, around, okay, what are we going to be doing with this particular development project? And, it doesn't happen because mistakes happen, right? Or something isn't attended to. In that more formal kind of space, there really is a kind of fear that will emerge, right? It is a fear of reprisal. It is like a fear of, okay, I'm not doing my job right. But having those informalities and kind of having this built in, again, a more popular education approach, I guess, so to speak, from actually doing the work rather than, maybe being taught or being told. It's seen as like a growing moment. Like it's not seen as something that's awful or the end all be all. And I think, again, that builds a sense of comfort, a sense of trust with the people that you're working with. And of course, that you're building with. And that's really where the growth comes. Again, it builds those stronger bonds. Like, for example, in our housing co-op at the York Nonprofit, and one of our student housing co-ops, the Least Housing Co-op, we had a lot of issues around conflict resolution. And, we approached NASCO for some learning. Shouts out to the North American Students for Cooperation. They did everything that they could, and our schedules didn't line up between the 5 members of that housing co-op. And so we really had to learn on the fly. And it's something that I think every single member of the co-op came out understanding that there needs to be more learning done around folks who are coming from intersectional backgrounds, particularly queer and BIPOC backgrounds, and how to address conflict within those realms. And, you know, it was very, very positive, because now when we're looking back at, okay, we're trying to develop our intake process, we're trying to develop or get more members into the housing co-op to address turnover with the semester. We're actually integrating that and changing that in our bylaws. We're developing different processes for conflict resolution that actually go beyond, you know, some of the documents that we're able to download or get from NASCO. And then that becomes a part of the conversations that we're having with you know, some of the amazing folks there. Folks like Brell, again, just names for exposure, but it really does create something that's a lot stronger, and it makes everybody who's working in the co-op, whether it's the staff or the members, a little bit more aware and more confident in the work that they're doing, and they listen more. You know, there's a little bit more care and attention in what they're doing. Mm-hmm.
So we have a question on the screen, but there were some questions in the room, and I actually want to bring in, because the questions are from Juliet and Obi from Black Women Professional Workers Co-op, and then Jean-Marie from La Termitière Co-op. And so I want to go to your questions, but I also want to bring in what Dr. Gordon Nemhard, because your co-ops, you've experienced this, because at the heart of your co-ops is the ROSCA model. And coming into a sector, and you've had your various experiences where you've been told, you know, don't put that as part of your business model because it won't be understood, by mainstream financial institutions, by the co-op sector. So you've had this experience of having the forms of cooperation that are central to self-determination in our communities devalued in your co-op journey. So wondering if you could speak to your experience with that, but then also ask your questions. Come on up. Juliet from BWPW Co-op.
Thank you. And thank you for that question, and excellent session, just really insightful. I want to just really acknowledge Dr. Jessica Nemhard. It was great to hear her speak, because her work and the work of Dr. Hussein, Caroline Hussein, have really been kind of like the lighthouse for what we're doing, and even the way that we're approaching what we're doing. Highly recommend Collective Courage. And the reason why I say this is that in coming across the barriers that we face, right, trying to explain the ROSCA model to different institutions, formal institutions, saying this is kind of like the core of what we do, we recognize that there were other organizations like us, other even new cooperatives that wanted to do this, and they were told no, right? And because we share information, we were aware of this. So we came into this with the backdrop of other people like Dr. Jessica and Dr. Caroline, who've really done the work, the academic work of creating, that safe space that values the work that we're doing, that values this system, this informal system that we've always had. So there's something that does for you. It gives you a sense of confidence, right? And it gives you a sense that you're not defensive. You also come away with a sense of empathy, of understanding that this pre-existing system, the capitalist, very patriarchal, very, exploitative system, is it's a made-up system, made up by men, right? And it just existed, and everybody just believed that that's what should be. So I think having that understanding, and then when you juxtapose that to COVID, what happened with the pandemic, it was like a reset. So for us, we've been having the conversations around ROSCAs prior to the pandemic. We've been organizing, running different ROSCAs. And so when the pandemic happened, it was important for us to now finally realize, the rest of the world now sees this model for what it is, the capitalist model. There's no basis, underlying basis for it. You had to go to work before, drive to your offices. Now everything was remote. So it was like, if that was possible before, why didn't anyone think about it, right? It's not that people weren't thinking about it. It's just that it didn't serve that system, right? When we started informal, the organization that was running the ROSCA since 2010, Whole Woman Network, we didn't have an office space, right? And I bring that in because when we would go in for like grants or even business plans with they're like, oh, but you have to have this. And we said, no, we just want to work out of coffee spaces. We want to go in and to people's basements, right, and run financial literacy workshop. We want to go to faith-based institutions because we recognize that with our communities, you actually have to go to them, because they're already doing it. Like you said, you're not teaching them anything new. So there has to be the humility, the flexibility to bring that education to them, recognizing what they're already doing. So tying all of this together, the barriers that we faced when we started talking about ROSCA, when we formalized and created a cooperative, we knew that if we were open enough to explain even to the formal sector, that they would gradually begin to get it. So if the financial institution, the big banks didn't get it, how about a credit union? They're a cooperative model, right? How about looking for someone within that space that kind of understands it? Maybe their grandparents had done it or they know communities. So the idea for me is this conversation around humility and empathy from all sides. This line of between the formal and informal, there's no firewall. You know, it's not hard and it's a blend. So that bigger solidarity economy, what can work? The challenges that we're facing are the challenges everyone is facing: housing, poverty, healthcare access, you know, those that are hit more, the marginalized communities. If we recognize that it's now about solution, then we should be humble enough to open up that box and have the bigger conversation. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we've gotten the 5 minutes. The 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes left in our session. So, Michael, you mentioned there was a question on. Okay, is it who's asking the question? Matt Noyes. Is the goal to get people to do what the educator co-op dev group think they should do, know what the educators think they should know, imagine, etc., or to get the people to do, know, imagine what they themselves think they should do, know, and imagine? And I think this also speaks a little bit to Esther, what you were saying, the co-op developer stepping into the space in almost a hierarchical way and saying, you know, I'm going to develop this co-op here, I'm going to develop this co-op there, and this is how we're going to do it, as opposed to what, you know, to Juliet was speaking about, which is, if anything, the co-op developer would listen, humble themselves, and be supportive to what groups already, you know that they need, if that's helpful. So I would like to, there's so many, this has been a wonderful discussion and there's so many questions, but let's take it to okay.
With Black Women Worker Co-op. Okay. Hello. Hi. Okay. So my name is Obia Gusiebe. I'm with the Black Women Worker Co-op, Black Women Professional Worker Co-op. Okay. So now, in terms of the role of the co-op developer education, right? So these are the thoughts that I had that I wanted to transfer, right? So now, there's a role, because if you look at co-op education as partnership creation, right? It simplifies the language, right? So now the government is looking to build more entrepreneurs, right? Okay, so the government is looking to create more entrepreneurs, right? And they're saying they want more young entrepreneurs. So if the co-op developer's role now is now created to go into those spaces, work with those youth, right, that ordinarily are afraid to start businesses on their own, and connect them together. Okay, you do this, you do this, you do this. You know, you guys can come together and work together. So now in that, should co-op be informal? It may not be informal, right? And so, sorry, it may not be formal. So, and if the government is looking at how they get their taxes from you, those are entrepreneurs working on their businesses. So they will still get their taxes back, right? They will still get paid their corporate taxes. But this, you are now enabling this youth to actually know how to work together to meet the needs of the community, right? So looking at it from that lens. Then two, same thing for organizations, right? So teaching them how to become partners, work together. So and I think for the local food and farms, when we went for the AGM, right, they spoke about that as well. So introducing organizations to themselves and making them work together formally or informally, right? Sorry, formally or informally. So introducing them to themselves and teaching them about partnerships, teaching them about opportunities and the social good that they are going to achieve. And that's generating income for the revenue for the community. And then the last one is, government already encourages partnerships when they ask for grants. So ecosystem. They go out to say, okay, you need to have community partners, or who are your partners in running this project or creating this program? You need to create partners. So your role, the role of the co-op developer is, or could be, working directly with the government to teach people how to work together, or teach people how to select partners, or to enable people how to okay, more like bringing the partners together, bringing the business organizations together, and then, okay, and then now matchmaking them. Okay, you can work with this, you can work with that, and just making it easier for people to form partnerships. Like, because when we look for grants, we okay, who is the best partner, who is the best, you know, so that's, I see it as a role of the co-op developer.
Obi. Any chance we could get 5 more minutes, Michael? Any chance at all? Okay, so we have Jean-Marie from La Termitière Co-op. Marie will be speaking in French. Of course, we have the
Ok. Merci pour la parole et merci pour vos interventions combien enrichissantes. Je reviens à une question et elle est importante. Je pense qu'on ne doit pas l'éluder comme ça. La question que vous avez posée, comment construire un organisme qui ne duplique pas les principes du capitalisme? Alors, ma question est celle-ci. Parce que nous parlons de l'éducation coopérative. Comment est-ce que vous pensez atteindre les non-atteints? Parce qu'un groupe comme celui-ci, c'est un groupe de gens éduqués qui sont allés à l'école, qui ont une certaine formation et qui participent dans le système. Mais il y a un groupe de gens qui subissent le système, qui ne sont peut-être pas à l'école ou n'ont pas eu une éducation comme la nôtre et ils subissent le système. Comment est-ce qu'on peut éduquer ces personnes-là et les impliquer dans le système coopératif pour qu'eux aussi bénéficient des acquis de la coopération coopérative? Voilà ma question.
Merci, Jean-Marie. So I'm going to ask, since all of our panelists don't speak French, can you translate the question so we could all participate in the answer?
And so it was really touching back and coming back to this question of how do we not replicate the very kind of capitalist functions, the racial capitalist functions that create challenges for folks. And then even more broadly, if we have two groups really of folks that are involved in, broadly speaking, cooperation, right? We have a segment of folks who are, quote unquote, well educated, right, that are very, very familiar with the space and that thrive using the tools and resources available in co-op education. And then separately, you have a group of folks that may not be formally quote unquote educated, but that use these tools and measures to survive on a day-to-day basis, right? And so the question was like, how do we bring these people into the fold? How do we bring those two groups together and essentially grow the sector? I thought it was a really, really amazing question, so thank you so much. I also did want to speak to that very quickly, if that's okay. Sorry. Yeah. No, and I want to think about it in terms of like examples, because that's what I've been doing today. And Juliette just brought up like a really, really cool, like in this particular context where you were speaking about going to the bank, and it's like they want you to have an office. For me, working with other cooperatives, I'd have been like, okay, hey, folks at Regenesis or folks at whatever, can I say that I'm using your office space so that I can get access to this grant? That actually only benefits me and potentially that office. And so what Julia proposed is actually, okay, no. You go to the bank and you use cooperative education to teach them, right? You teach the institution that is not the way, that the informality needs to be incorporated into that process. By doing that, you're not just benefiting yourself, right? You're actually benefiting anybody who wants to get into that space. That to me is a much more radical potential, and that to me like speaks ways and notions about how cooperative education should be used. And so I just wanted to bring up that example again, and that is where I see that kind of gap being bridged, right? Like between those two, is that now potentially this quote unquote more informal group might have access to those resources, might have access to building additional capacity because work was done by either member of those groups, because they use cooperative education to impress knowledge upon those institutions. So sorry, thank you so much. I just wanted to add to that.
Or charity, and I mean particularly. Sorry. Go ahead.
In speaking, I think that we have to be open to meeting people where they're at, and that was mentioned earlier. But then no matter what room or circle you're in most cases, you're going to have people at different levels, and so is the overcoming those gaps. May not actually happen through the developer, but it may happen internally within that group. And it's that peer piece. It's that understanding of where everyone is at and being able to expose yourself and trust within the group that you're working in that I'm not there yet, And so is how do I get you there? How do I lift up the person next to me? Because now we're in this together, we're bound together. So is how do we lift each other up in order to move us, and some people are going to move faster than others, but it's not that you give up or you isolate them because they're not where we want them to be or where they should be. Is how do we collectively lift each other up in that process, and education is part of that. Every classroom you go in, there's individuals in the hierarchical way that are at different levels, but is a lot of times the formal systems fails those individuals because they're not where they want them or they see them to be at, and so then people get left behind. So is having that a sense of formality of moving together, but then having that informality of, okay, we can do this differently. We can be flexible. We can be adaptive in order to lift each other up and move. And we can still move at the same pace. But, the thing is we may actually accelerate it because there may be a different thought process or a diversity in the thinking of being at the different levels because that individual is used to having to work a little harder to thrive and survive. So is bringing all that in so there's a place for everybody at the table. It's a matter of how do we share what's on the table so that everybody can eat.
My final comment but is there a space for co-op education and development to expand to also include that toolkit? Because it's one thing to tell a group of people, to try to figure out if folks are at different places, leaving it to them to figure out how to work together. But could that be part of our toolkit? Charity, speaking about, can we build partnerships between co-op developers and educators, equity and inclusion, accessibility, professionals with lived experience, academics, anyone who can have an answer to, here's the approaches you can take to get everyone to be able to communicate, together, to learn together. Is this a space where we could start building out cooperative solidarity economy resources, whatever we want to call it, where that is all in-house? So if a group is struggling with that, they can actually go, we need help as a group to bring our respective knowledges and lived experiences together in order to cooperate. And as we plan and dream and scheme and say, let's build this commons together, thinking more broadly along those lines. Oh, yes. Michael, how are we? One more.
What she's speaking to is, I think we all also have to be willing to be coachable, and then also to coach each other up as peers, and so is that, I think that's going to be a part of that, bringing that together. And then we're going to have that space and that place to actually have those tools, to house those tools and those resources that everybody can locate and be able to access, And so if everybody has that access, then we have a sense of a level of equity, you know what I mean? There's always going to be barriers, but we can reduce those barriers and have those tools ready and available to collaborate, cooperate, and coach each other up.
To Mike Noyes' question from the chat, it was like, do we try to, have cooperative developers and work with what they think should be done, or with, what the communities are trying to imagine? I very much agree, but I'm also thinking like moving beyond even like what is within the co-op movement, looking at institutions that are essentially governing the co-op movement. To Juliet's question, thinking about how we use those resources that we're building together, that we're using to foster each other, and being like, hey, this is what works for people, and changing the institutions that are preventing that from happening. And I just wanted to bring up another example, right? Like, we work very closely with the Unité de Travail pour l'implémentation de logement étudiant, it's UTIL in Quebec. One of the big things that they do is that they realize that other groups, like, for example, House, or, if the Alma Mater Society in BC wanted to develop student housing, the big challenge is that they're not recognized as a priority group under the National Housing Strategy. So what they do is they try to advocate at a political level to be like, hey, the province, the municipality, recognize students as a priority group, recognize them as a very diverse, multiplicitous group that really needs housing. We do the same thing in Ontario now. Like, that's a big part of our strategy, is not to just be like, okay, let's see if we can get money for us, but is to be like, okay, how do we change the minds of policymakers at the top? How do we get them to recognize that other people will also, this is an issue that is faced by a lot of people, and it disproportionately impacts racialized, low-income communities, right? So, like, how do we get them to recognize that? How do we show them that? And then open up those opportunities for everybody, so that the tools and the resources that we're developing within the co-op movement, within the co-op sector, can be maximally beneficial, right? So that's yeah, I just wanted to bring that in, and to Mike's question, yeah, my apologies.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gary, Natty, Charity. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Jean-Marie. Thank you, Obi. Thank you, Juliette. Thank you to everyone tuning in online and having discussions in the chat and questions. Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nemhard, Josephine Gray, co-founder of St. Jamestown Community Co-op in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Thank you for your question, Matt. Thank you for this discussion, everybody. Thank you, Michael, for the extra time.
Check. All right. So I would like to give one more round of applause for our panelists. That was absolutely fantastic. What a great way to kind of wrap up the formal part of the ACE Institute for 2022. But we do have 2 discussions remaining. I would encourage you to go out, grab some lunch, and take a quick break. Before we do that, I am going to get just a quick photo of everyone in the room at the back near the ACE wall. So hopefully we can just arrange that really quickly. And then this afternoon, I understand some of you otherwise have flights that you need to catch and stuff. Sean is coordinating all of that, whether you are getting transportation to the airport, transportation to the bus terminal, whatever it may be, we're arranging that. And we spoke to UBC in order to get later checkout. So they said that they were able to provide you with 3 to 4 hours of additional time to check out. So that's from 11 o'clock. So if you could please make sure that your stuff is out around 2, 3 p.m. max, that would be strongly appreciated by the cleaning staff so that they can prepare for the next people who are coming for another conference that's starting tomorrow. Thank you so much. I will hand it off to Steve in just a moment, but this afternoon, just a quick synopsis of